For most people, COP refers to uniformed civil servants that look after security in the streets. The COP, as in Conference of Parties, also looks after security, in this case the climate security of the human ecosystem. COP is the supreme governing body of an international treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, commonly referred to as the UNFCCC. COP28 will start in 2 days in Dubai and will run until the 12th of December under the leadership of Sheikh Sultan Al Jaber. Looking at what has happened, even since the much praised COP21, remember the Paris increased ambition, but do not remember a Paris increased action plan, one wonders how a process that started out with such good intentions nearly half a century ago still has not delivered on what it set out to do. The process almost seems like New Year's resolutions that are usually forgotten before the end of January. As this dashboard shows, planet Earth, or more precisely several framework conditions of the human ecosystem, have problems that are exponentially getting worse. Are we now too late to preserve the framework conditions our species need to thrive? While it is good that so many countries participate, the COP process has a serious flaw. Its scope is too narrow. It is a process that tries to open a 3-lock door towards a future in which climate warming should stay within 1.5 degrees with just the key of one lock. This is why the door cannot open. The only lock for which the Conference of Parties bring the key are supply-side solutions, which is the orange section in its graph. But without also reaching agreements on demand-side solutions in blue and nature-based solutions in green, the door cannot open. If that does not happen, the desirable future will remain out of reach and a hothouse Earth scenario looms. Whilst we still must agree to the structural measures to tackle the cause, we are now too late, which is why we now also have to tackle the symptoms. To provide relief, active cooling in various forms are now imperative to prevent hothouse Earth conditions to set in. Talking about warming has to be enlarged with action about cooling. This picture shows an interesting face down, with on the right the very experienced and rare chemical engineer in the European Parliament, MEP Bas Eickhout, who was interviewing the then candidate climate commissioner Wopke Hoekstra on the left. The European Parliament's Environment Committee decided after the interview that it was not good enough and demanded written answers to additional questions. Thus the Parliament obtained in writing the commitment of the new climate commissioner that Europe will table that international aviation and shipping emissions are sectors where more action to reduce them is needed in line with IPCC's AR6 Workgroup 3 report. The likelihood of this being agreed at COP28 is minimal. So the EU better invest in high-speed international rail connections to reduce intra-European flights. Japan has done this already, and the US clearly is lagging far behind, but would be well advised to do the same. Here we get to the crux of the problem of energy climate 2024 and beyond. We are reality blind in thinking we have time for the transition. Many trends toward tipping points show exponential patterns. American mathematician Alfred Bartlett famously said, "The greatest weakness of humanity is its inability to understand the exponential function." With exponential developments, unless you act early on the flat part of the curve, or if you wish the first row of the chessboard, where things still can be kept in hand, we will be overwhelmed by the consequences once the exponential trends gain momentum. Once in the elbow, or second row of the chessboard, things do get out of hand. This brings me to a very important concept: time to effect. If you have a headache and you take an aspirin, after 1 second you still have a headache. And after 1 minute you also still have a headache. If you're lucky, after 1 hour it may subside, but normally it takes a couple of hours for the aspirin to have effect. The same is true for the structural measures we of course still need to take to address the cause, be they reducing emissions or removing emissions by CCS or reforestation. But the time to effect of these measures is too long. Even if we stop anthropogenic emissions today, due to the historic emissions and the climate inertia, global warming would still go on. Many of the structural measures need 20 plus years to have effect. Also, growing a 20-year-old tree takes 20 years. Even with more goodwill, these measures cannot avoid hothouse Earth conditions to set in. These would increase loss and damages and trigger climate change-induced mass migration to such an extent that it would render the structural measures ineffective or largely overwhelm their positive effects with greater negative effects. The most serious form of loss and damages will be caused by sea level rise. What energy is to mitigation is water to adaptation, including protecting ourselves from sea level rise. Few people know that Antarctica is bigger than Australia and bigger than the US. Its surface is 1/35 of the current ocean surface. This means that for every 35 meters of ice that melts in Antarctica, oceans worldwide will rise with 1 meter. Even fewer people know that with an average height of 2,000 meters and peaks of 4.5 kilometers, it also is the highest continent on Earth. Antarctica contains 25 million cubic kilometers of frozen water stacked up like a gigantic tower of ice. If all that ice melts, sea level rise will be more than 70 meters. The Greenland glacier alone is good for 7 meters sea level rise. Fortunately, big ice masses melt slowly. But once the melting gains momentum, it accelerates and becomes unstoppable. We still have a small window of opportunity to slow down this process and to keep the Arctic in the Arctics a little longer, to buy time for the complex interconnected transitions that will be needed to remain within capacity. Eventually, through the communicating vessel principle, the world's coast, where the last 200 years billions of citizens and trillions of capital assets have been situated, are now at risk. Not overnight, but moving them higher up will not happen overnight either. It may take the larger part of a century, during which even more resources and energy will be required to first build an equivalent capacity infrastructure to move to, whilst trying to rescue as much as possible for reuse from the existing coastal infrastructures. Already today, we should accelerate non-regrets and surely stop sure regrets. We must think systemically and adjust our plans to be less reality blind. The point is, besides whether we will have the energy and resources to do all this, we need time for it too. Time we will not have if hothouse Earth conditions would set in to aggravate our predicament and reduce our ability to respond to these challenges. Only with active cooling can we avoid hothouse Earth conditions to set in. With a number of decades of active cooling, we can peak shave the heat overshoot effects to give the required time to have effect to the structural measures we still must take, for them to tackle the cause. Just like a headache and migraine medication vary from homeopathic with pharmaceutical to even surgical interventions, active cooling too has a range of interventions. Do you actually know what the difference is between black, grey and white clouds? The color of clouds is not determined by the quantity of water, but by the size of the droplets in the cloud. If the quantity of water is distributed over fewer big droplets, the clouds look dark and let the droplets fall as rain. The same amount of water distributed over more but smaller droplets make the clouds grey and less chance of precipitation. If distributed as even more and even smaller droplets, the clouds become white and there will be no precipitation. If the water is distributed in even thinner humidity, we see a blue sky, until an airplane passes through it and the humidity forms small droplets around the exhaust nuclei to form the condensation trails. Already in the 1970s, scientists found ways to influence this with biomimicry methods that imitate the effect of a storm at sea. By nebulizing seawater underneath big black cloud systems, the salt particles rise and split the big droplets in more smaller droplets, thus changing the color of the clouds from dark to light, thus also increasing its reflectiveness and thereby contributing to cooling. If we act this decade, we can achieve up to 1 degree cooling with large-scale biomimicry, for whitening or brightening of dark clouds to increase their reflectiveness or albedo. This is why in warm climate, houses and cars often are painted white. If we will not act this decade, the situation will get more severe. And consequently, more severe methods of cooling may be required as well. Even ones that may have unintended side effects or longer persistency periods than the very localized and time-bound method of, for example, marine cloud brightening or MCB. Is this not geoengineering? Ask many people. The severer forms of active cooling are. But have we not been engaging in geoengineering for the last 2 centuries? Bringing up billions of tons of stored hydrocarbons in the form of coal, oil and gas from underneath the subsoil geology and putting it up into the atmosphere? This will remain the biggest geoengineering project ever undertaken on this planet. Ah yes, they respond, but that was not the intention. That may be true, but does that make a difference? The benign local biomimicry methods of cooling are definitely not geoengineering. At best they are cloud engineering. But if done like a mosaic of projects all over the world that are switched on and off when effective and taking into account local needs, the intended overall effect indeed is global cooling to avoid the disastrous hothouse Earth conditions to set in. A service that can preserve the framework conditions of the ecosystem that our species now needs more than ever before. Clearly, it cannot wait until COP100. If active cooling will not be rolled out at scale, the framework conditions for the ecosystem for our species will have expired on large part of the planet. Whilst that is no issue for the planet, which is known many framework condition regimes, it is an issue for currently living species that belong to the Holocene. Because if those conditions expire, our species will expire too. Needless to say, this is not on the agenda of COP28. 2 of the most senior European representatives are hailing from the Netherlands, both very well aware of the consequences of not discussing this, and they are intimately involved in what Europe will bring to the table. Sadly, the European Council, whilst recognizing the critical role of oceans, their blue carbon function, and the critical need to protect, conserve and restore terrestrial ecosystems, including forests, as well as inland and coastal water ecosystems, at this moment do not have the intention to even discuss active cooling whilst they are there. Bas, pity Wouter and I could not come to see you before you set off to the United Arab Emirates. We are both on the Energy 2024 summit where we spoke about the imperative of active cooling. It is under your remit, Bas, to at least raise this idea, to plant the seed for it to be discussed more fully next year or in Brazil. I'm afraid that if you will not find a way to do so, this will become the greatest regret of your life.